Topeka, Kansas. 1950. In the heart of America's post-war boom, a quiet revolution began in a Kansas courthouse. The year was 1950. Topeka was a city of tree-lined streets and modest homes. Churches stood on every corner. Children walked to school each morning with lunch pails in hand. But not all children walked the same path. Oliver Brown lived on First Street with his wife Leola and their 3 daughters. He worked as a welder for the Santa Fe Railroad. He attended services at St. Mark's AME Church every Sunday. He was a quiet man who believed in hard work and fairness. His eldest daughter, Linda, was 7 years old. She had bright eyes and a quick smile. Each morning, she walked 6 blocks through the railroad switch yard. She waited for a bus in all kinds of weather. The bus took her to Monroe Elementary, an all-black school across town. 4 blocks from their home stood Sumner Elementary. It was a school for white children only. Linda could see it from her window. She could not attend. This was the law in Topeka. This was the law in 17 states. This was the law across much of America. Separate, but equal. The legal foundation was 54 years old. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson. The decision said separate facilities for black and white citizens were constitutional. They only needed to be equal in quality. The phrase became doctrine, separate but equal. But the reality was never equal. Black schools received less funding, their buildings were older, their textbooks were worn and outdated, their teachers were paid lower salaries. In some rural areas, black children attended school only 4 months a year, while white children attended 9. By 1950, segregation touched every part of American life. Water fountains, restrooms, restaurants, movie theaters, bus seats, waiting rooms, beaches, parks, hospitals, cemeteries. The line was drawn from birth to death. In the South, the separation was total and enforced by law. In border states like Kansas, the rules were softer but still present. In the North, segregation existed without formal laws. Neighborhoods were divided. Schools reflected those divisions. Oliver Brown saw his daughter walking past the white school each morning. He saw her standing in the cold, waiting for a bus. He made a decision. In September 1950, he walked with Linda to Sumner Elementary. He asked to enroll her. The principal refused. The law was clear. Oliver Brown was not a lawyer or an activist. He was a father who wanted his daughter to attend the closest school. He did not know his name would enter history. The NAACP comes to Topeka. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been fighting school segregation for years. Their strategy was careful and methodical. They recruited local families willing to challenge the system. They built cases showing that separate was never equal. They aimed to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson itself. Thurgood Marshall led the legal team. He was 32 years old in 1950. He had won 29 cases before the Supreme Court. He grew up in Baltimore, where he attended segregated schools. He graduated from Howard University Law School because the University of Maryland would not admit him. Marshall was tall and commanding. He spoke with precision. He understood the law and he understood people. He traveled across the South taking cases that other lawyers feared. He received death threats regularly. He kept working. In Topeka, the NAACP found 13 families willing to join the lawsuit. Oliver Brown's name came first alphabetically. The case became Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Similar cases were forming in South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. Each challenged school segregation. Each told the story of children denied equal education. The lawyers knew they faced a monumental task. They were asking the Supreme Court to reverse its own precedent. They were challenging a social order that had stood for generations. The first trial, June 1951. The case was heard in Federal District Court in Topeka. The NAACP presented evidence of psychological harm. They called Dr. Hugh W. Spear, a professor of education. He testified that segregation damaged both black and white children. It created feelings of inferiority. It distorted the educational process. The school board's lawyers argued that Topeka's black schools were substantially equal to white schools. They pointed to similar facilities and resources. They said the issue was social policy, not constitutional law. The judges agreed the schools were roughly equal in physical terms. But they also noted something important. They wrote that segregation had a detrimental effect on black children. It deprived them of benefits they would receive in integrated schools. Despite this finding, the court ruled against Brown. The judges felt bound by Plessy v. Ferguson. Only the Supreme Court could overturn that precedent. The NAACP appealed immediately. This was exactly what they wanted. They needed the case to reach the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court, 1952. By late 1952, 5 school segregation cases had reached the Supreme Court. Brown v. Board of Education from Kansas, Briggs v. Elliott from South Carolina, Davis v. County School Board from Virginia, Gebhardt v. Belton from Delaware, Bowling v. Sharp from Washington, D.C. The court combined them under the Brown name. The cases were scheduled for argument in December 1952. Thurgood Marshall and his team prepared for months. They refined their arguments. They anticipated every counterpoint. They knew this might be their only chance. The central question was simple but profound. Did segregation in public schools violate the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under law? Marshall argued that segregation inherently created inequality. Separate could never be equal. The very act of separation sent a message of inferiority. It damaged children psychologically and educationally. The lawyers defending segregation argued that the 14th Amendment's authors never intended to prohibit separate schools. They claimed states had the right to organize their schools as they saw fit. They warned that forced integration would cause social chaos. The justices listened for 3 days. They asked hard questions. Then they did something unexpected. They asked both sides to return the following year for re-argument. They wanted more information about the historical intent of the 14th Amendment. Legal scholars debated what this meant. Some thought the court was divided. Others believed the justices wanted more time to build consensus. A Nation Waits, 1953. While lawyers prepared for re-argument, the nation continued its daily routines. Children attended segregated schools in 17 states and Washington, D.C. In many northern cities, schools were effectively segregated by neighborhood boundaries. The Cold War dominated headlines. America was locked in competition with the Soviet Union. The Korean War had recently ended. Senator Joseph McCarthy was hunting communists in government. Television was changing American culture. Against this backdrop, school segregation seemed to some like an internal matter. To others, it was a moral crisis that contradicted American ideals. Foreign newspapers covered the case with interest. The Soviet Union used American segregation in propaganda. They pointed to the gap between American promises of freedom and the reality of racial oppression. President Eisenhower had taken office in January 1953. He was not eager to address the segregation issue. He believed in gradual change. He worried about enforcing a court ruling in the South. In September 1953, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died suddenly of a heart attack. President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, the governor of California, as the new Chief Justice. This change would prove crucial. December 1953. Re-argument. The Supreme Court heard arguments again in December 1953. Thurgood Marshall focused on the human cost of segregation. He presented social science evidence showing psychological damage to black children. He cited studies by Dr. Kenneth Clark using dolls to demonstrate how segregation created feelings of inferiority. Clark had shown black children a white doll and a black doll. He asked which was nice, which was bad, which they would prefer to play with. Most children chose the white doll. They associated black with negative traits. The segregated system had taught them to devalue themselves. Marshall's voice was steady and clear. The only way that this court can decide this case in opposition to our position is that there must be some reason which gives the state the right to make a classification that they can make in regard to nothing else in regard to Negroes. And we submit the only way to arrive at this decision is to find that, for some reason, Negroes are inferior to all other human beings. The attorney for South Carolina, John W. Davis, was 80 years old. He was one of America's most respected lawyers. He had argued more Supreme Court cases than anyone alive. He defended segregation as a matter of state sovereignty and social tradition. Your honors are dealing here with a question that is not a question of racial superiority or inferiority, Davis argued. It is a question of preference on the part of both races for that which has been established by long custom and usage. The courtroom was tense. Everyone knew the stakes. This was not simply about schools. This was about the future of American society. The wait. Months passed with no decision. Behind closed doors, Chief Justice Warren worked to build unanimous support. He knew a divided court would weaken the ruling's authority. He knew resistance would be fierce. Some justices were sympathetic to ending segregation, but worried about implementation. Some were concerned about federal intrusion into state matters. Some represented Southern backgrounds and understood the depth of regional resistance. Warren met with each justice privately. He listened to their concerns. He worked to address their hesitations. He emphasized the moral weight of the moment. The legal community speculated constantly. Newspapers ran articles debating possible outcomes. Civil rights organizations waited anxiously. Southern politicians prepared defenses of segregation. Linda Brown continued attending Monroe Elementary. She was now 10 years old. She did not fully understand that her name was attached to a case that might change America. Oliver Brown went to work each day at the railroad. He hoped he had done the right thing. He wondered what would come next. May 17, 1954. The announcement came without warning. On Monday, May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Chief Justice Warren read the opinion himself. His voice was measured and firm. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and citizens. The opinion was relatively brief. It focused on education's importance in American life. It acknowledged the debate over the 14th Amendment's original intent. Then it moved to the central question. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? Warren paused. We believe that it does. The court unanimously ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Segregation violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned in the context of public education. The opinion cited the psychological studies. To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. The final sentence was simple and absolute. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The courtroom erupted in muted gasps and whispers. Reporters rushed to phones. The news spread across the nation within minutes. Immediate reactions. The response was swift and divided. Thurgood Marshall stood on the Supreme Court steps and called it the greatest victory we ever had. He smiled broadly for photographers. He knew the fight was far from over, but this was a historic milestone. The NAACP headquarters in New York received calls from across the country. Many were celebratory, some were threatening. The organization prepared for the next phase, implementation. President Eisenhower made no public statement that day. Privately, he was unhappy with the ruling. He believed it would create social turmoil. He later said appointing Earl Warren was the biggest damned fool mistake I ever made. In Topeka, Oliver Brown learned of the decision at work. He felt relief and pride. He hoped Linda and her sisters would benefit from the change. Linda Brown heard the news from her parents that evening. She understood it meant something important. She did not yet grasp the magnitude. Northern newspapers generally praised the decision. The New York Times called it a monumental constructive stride in constitutional law and fundamental justice. The Washington Post said it was a new birth of freedom. Southern newspapers reacted with anger and defiance. The Jackson Daily News in Mississippi declared, "Human blood may stain Southern soil in many places because of this decision." Georgia's Governor Herman Talmadge said the court had reduced the Constitution to a mere scrap of paper. Moderate Southern voices existed, but were often drowned out. Some white Southerners privately agreed with the decision but feared social ostracism if they said so publicly. Black communities across the South celebrated quietly. They knew celebration must be tempered with caution. They understood resistance would be fierce. They had learned through generations that legal victories did not guarantee safety. The implementation question. The court had ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, but it did not say how or when schools must integrate. This was deliberate. The justices knew implementation would be complex and controversial. They scheduled new arguments for the following year to address the remedy phase. In April 1955, the court issued a second decision known as Brown II. It ordered schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. This phrase was intentionally vague. It gave districts some flexibility in timing, but required good faith efforts. Some justices were sympathetic to ending segregation, but worried about implementation. Some were concerned about federal intrusion into state matters. Some represented Southern backgrounds and understood the depth of regional resistance. Warren met with each justice privately. He listened to their concerns. He worked to address their hesitations. He emphasized the moral weight of the moment. The legal community speculated constantly. Newspapers ran articles debating possible outcomes. Civil rights organizations waited anxiously. Southern politicians prepared defenses of segregation. Linda Brown continued attending Monroe Elementary. She was now 10 years old. She did not fully understand that her name was attached to a case that might change America. Oliver Brown went to work each day at the railroad. He hoped he had done the right thing. He wondered what would come next. May 17, 1954. The announcement came without warning. On Monday, May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Chief Justice Warren read the opinion himself. His voice was measured and firm. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and citizens. The opinion was relatively brief. It focused on education's importance in American life. It acknowledged the debate over the 14th Amendment's original intent. Then it moved to the central question. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? Warren paused. We believe that it does. The court unanimously ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Segregation violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned in the context of public education. The opinion cited the psychological studies. To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. The final sentence was simple and absolute. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The courtroom erupted in muted gasps and whispers. Reporters rushed to phones. The news spread across the nation within minutes. Immediate reactions. The response was swift and divided. Thurgood Marshall stood on the Supreme Court steps and called it the greatest victory we ever had. He smiled broadly for photographers. He knew the fight was far from over, but this was a historic milestone. The NAACP headquarters in New York received calls from across the country. Many were celebratory, some were threatening. The organization prepared for the next phase, implementation. President Eisenhower made no public statement that day. Privately, he was unhappy with the ruling. He believed it would create social turmoil. He later said appointing Earl Warren was the biggest damned fool mistake I ever made. In Topeka, Oliver Brown learned of the decision at work. He felt relief and pride. He hoped Linda and her sisters would benefit from the change. Linda Brown heard the news from her parents that evening. She understood it meant something important. She did not yet grasp the magnitude. Northern newspapers generally praised the decision. The New York Times called it a monumental constructive stride in constitutional law and fundamental justice. The Washington Post said it was a new birth of freedom. Southern newspapers reacted with anger and defiance. The Jackson Daily News in Mississippi declared, "Human blood may stain Southern soil in many places because of this decision." Georgia's Governor Herman Talmadge said the court had reduced the Constitution to a mere scrap of paper. Moderate Southern voices existed, but were often drowned out. Some white Southerners privately agreed with the decision but feared social ostracism if they said so publicly. Black communities across the South celebrated quietly. They knew celebration must be tempered with caution. They understood resistance would be fierce. They had learned through generations that legal victories did not guarantee safety. The implementation question. The court had ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, but it did not say how or when schools must integrate. This was deliberate. The justices knew implementation would be complex and controversial. They scheduled new arguments for the following year to address the remedy phase. In April 1955, the court issued a second decision known as Brown II. It ordered schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. This phrase was intentionally vague. It gave districts some flexibility in timing, but required good faith efforts. The ambiguity created problems. Many Southern districts interpreted all deliberate speed as permission to delay indefinitely. They created bureaucratic obstacles. They passed state laws attempting to nullify the federal ruling. They closed public schools rather than integrate. The court's lack of specificity reflected a strategic calculation. The justices hoped gradualism would reduce resistance. They were wrong. Massive resistance. Southern political leaders organized opposition immediately. In March 1956, 96 Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto. They pledged to use all lawful means to resist the Brown decision. They called it a clear abuse of judicial power. They encouraged states to defy implementation. Only 3 Southern senators refused to sign: Lyndon Johnson of Texas, Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, and Albert Gore Sr. of Tennessee. Their refusal took political courage. State legislatures passed hundreds of laws designed to prevent integration. Virginia authorized closing any school ordered to integrate. Alabama made it illegal for white and black children to attend school together. Georgia cut off funding to integrated schools. Citizens' councils formed across the South. These were white supremacist organizations that used economic and social pressure against integration supporters. They were less violent than the Ku Klux Klan, but equally committed to maintaining segregation. Black families who pushed for integration faced severe consequences. They lost jobs. Their homes were vandalized. They received death threats. Some were murdered. Progress was painfully slow. By 1960, only 98 of Arkansas's 104,000 black students attended integrated schools. In 5 Deep South states, not a single black child attended school with white children. Little Rock, 1957. The most famous confrontation came in September 1957. Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas was scheduled to admit 9 black students. The students had been carefully selected. They had strong academic records. They understood they would face hostility. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus called out the National Guard. He ordered them to prevent the black students from entering. He claimed he was protecting public safety. On September 4th, 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford walked alone to the school entrance. She wore a crisp white dress her mother had made. She carried her school books. She did not know the other 8 students had agreed to arrive together. She had no phone at home and missed the message. A mob of white people surrounded her. They shouted slurs. They spat at her. They threatened to lynch her. Photos of her walking through the crowd, maintaining her dignity while adults screamed hatred, circulated worldwide. The National Guard turned her away. The other 8 students also could not enter. President Eisenhower could no longer avoid involvement. He met with Governor Faubus, but gained no cooperation. When the governor withdrew the National Guard, violent mobs took control. On September 24th, Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. Soldiers with bayonets escorted the 9 students into school. The images were powerful. American soldiers protecting black children from white mobs contradicted national myths about freedom and democracy. The Soviet Union used the images in propaganda around the world. The Little Rock 9 endured daily abuse inside the school. Students tripped them in hallways. They were pushed downstairs. Food was thrown at them in the cafeteria. Teachers often looked away. One of the 9, Minigen Brown, was expelled for defending herself against harassment. 8 of the 9 finished the year. Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate from Central High. Martin Luther King Jr. attended his graduation ceremony. The next year, Governor Faubus closed all Little Rock high schools rather than continue integration. They remained closed for the entire 1958 to 1959 school year. This became known as the Lost Year. Virginia's Prince Edward County. The most extreme resistance occurred in Prince Edward County, Virginia. This was one of the original 5 cases combined under Brown. Black students there had gone on strike in 1951 to protest terrible school conditions. Their case, Davis versus County School Board, was part of the Supreme Court's 1954 decision. When ordered to integrate in 1959, the County Board of Supervisors simply closed all public schools. They remained closed for 5 years. White families created private academies, funded through tuition grants and tax credits. Black children had no schools at all. Some moved away to live with relatives in other areas. Some received tutoring in church basements. Many received no education during those years. The county's position was clear. They would rather have no public schools than integrated schools. The Supreme Court finally forced the schools to reopen in 1964. By then, a generation of black children in Prince Edward County had lost years of education. The civil rights movement grows. The Brown decision energized the broader civil rights movement. In December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. The resulting bus boycott lasted 381 days. It brought a young minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. to national prominence. In February 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. The sit-in movement spread across the South. Young people faced violence and arrest to challenge segregation. Freedom Riders in 1961 tested integration of interstate bus terminals. They were beaten by mobs in Alabama. Their buses were firebombed. Throughout the early 1960s, demonstrations multiplied. Birmingham, Albany, Selma. Each campaign faced police dogs, fire hoses, and mass arrests. The movement's moral force grew. Television brought images of peaceful protesters being beaten into American living rooms. Many white Americans who had been indifferent began to feel shame and outrage. President John F. Kennedy initially moved cautiously on civil rights. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963 forced his hand. He proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation. His assassination in November 1963 gave the cause a martyr. President Lyndon Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Act through Congress in 1964. It banned discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965. Implementation accelerates. Real progress in school integration came slowly through the 1960s. The Supreme Court grew impatient with all deliberate speed. In 1968, the court ruled in Greenville County School Board that districts must take immediate steps to create unitary school systems. Token integration was no longer acceptable. In 1969, the court ruled in Alexander v. Holmes County that districts must integrate at once. The 14-year period of delay officially ended. The Nixon administration enforced these rulings more than many expected. Federal officials threatened to cut funding to districts that maintained dual systems. This financial pressure proved effective. By 1970, Southern schools had become more integrated than schools in the North. The percentage of black students in majority white Southern schools rose from 0 in 1954 to 32% in 1968 to 44% in 1972. But new challenges emerged. White families in many areas moved to suburbs or enrolled children in private academies. This white flight created de facto segregation based on residential patterns rather than law. Northern cities faced their own reckoning. Boston's busing crisis of 1974 showed that school integration was not simply a Southern problem. White parents in South Boston rioted when black students were bused to their schools. Courts ordered busing to achieve integration in many cities. This proved deeply unpopular across racial lines. Many black families wanted better schools in their own neighborhoods rather than long bus rides to hostile environments. The people behind the case. Oliver Brown never sought fame. He participated in the lawsuit because it was right. He continued working for the railroad. He died of a heart attack in 1961 at age 42. He did not live to see significant integration in Topeka's schools. Linda Brown attended integrated schools after the decision. She later became an educational consultant. She spoke often about her father's courage. She died in 2018 at age 76. Thurgood Marshall continued fighting civil rights cases. In 1967, President Johnson appointed him to the Supreme Court. He became the first black Supreme Court justice. He served until 1991. He died in 1993 at age 84. Chief Justice Earl Warren led the court through a remarkable period of expanding civil rights. The Warren Court also ruled on voting rights, criminal procedure, and individual liberties. Warren retired in 1969. He died in 1974 at age 83. The Little Rock Nine endured their year at Central High. Most went on to successful careers. Ernest Green worked in the Carter administration. Minigen Brown Trickey became a writer and activist. Elizabeth Eckford struggled with the trauma for years. In 1997, she reconciled publicly with one of the white students who had screamed at her in the famous photograph. Many local heroes never made headlines. Teachers who integrated faculties faced ostracism. Families who supported integration lost businesses. Children who walked through hostile crowds showed extraordinary courage. Their names are mostly forgotten. 50 years later. On May 17, 2004, the 50th anniversary of Brown, commemorations were held across America. Scholars debated the decision's legacy. All agreed it was constitutionally and morally correct. Many noted that full integration had never been achieved. By 2004, American schools were resegregating. Supreme Court decisions in the 1990s limited the use of race in school assignments. White flight to suburbs had created demographic segregation. School funding remained deeply unequal. The typical Black or Latino student attended a school where most students were poor. The typical white student attended a school where most students were middle class. Separate had returned. Equal remained elusive. Yet the principle established in Brown endured. Legally mandated racial segregation was finished. The decision had changed American law fundamentally. It declared that equality before the law was not negotiable. Brown also transformed constitutional interpretation. The court's willingness to consider social science evidence and real-world effects influenced later decisions on discrimination. The decision helped launch the modern civil rights movement. It showed that the Constitution could be an instrument of justice. It inspired activists to keep fighting. Topeka remembers. The Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site opened in Topeka in 2004. It occupies the former Monroe Elementary School, where Linda Brown was supposed to attend. The building had been closed in 1975. It sat empty for years. Now it tells the story of the case and its context. Visitors walk through exhibits showing segregation's reality. They see photographs of separate schools. They learn about the families who joined the lawsuit. They listen to oral histories. One exhibit features the famous doll test that Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted. Visitors can see how segregation damaged children's self-image. The site does not present a triumphant narrative. It shows both progress and unfinished work. It asks visitors to think about equality in their own time. Topeka's schools finally achieved meaningful integration in the 1970s, but demographic changes have brought resegregation. Some Topeka schools today are predominantly minority. Others are predominantly white. The city wrestles honestly with this reality. They know their place in history brings responsibility. Unfinished business. The promise of Brown versus Board of Education remains incompletely fulfilled. American schools in 2024 are more segregated now than in the 1980s. School funding gaps persist between wealthy and poor districts. Discipline practices disproportionately affect black students. Achievement gaps remain significant, yet legal segregation is gone. That matters profoundly. The principle that the Constitution guarantees equal protection has expanded to other areas. Gender discrimination, LGBT rights, immigrant rights, all trace their legal foundations partly to Brown. The decision showed that citizens could challenge injustice through the courts. It demonstrated that change, however slow and difficult, was possible. It proved that moral arguments could reshape law. Oliver Brown did not set out to change America. He walked his daughter to a school 4 blocks away. He asked if she could attend. He was told no. He decided that answer was unacceptable. That simple act of parental love and civic courage became part of a larger movement. It connected to other acts of courage by people whose names we know and many whose names we do not. The schoolhouse door that was closed to Linda Brown in 1951 opened in 1954. It has never fully closed again. That is the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education. The last word. In 1993, Thurgood Marshall gave one of his final interviews before his death. The interviewer asked if he was satisfied with the progress since Brown. Marshall, then 84 years old and in failing health, paused before answering. "I'm not satisfied," he said, "but I'm not dissatisfied either." He explained that Brown had set a principle. The principle was correct. Making it real in every community was the work of generations. He would not see it completed. Neither would his children. Maybe his grandchildren would. "The fight never ends," Marshall said. "You just have to keep fighting." Oliver Brown's fight began at a school registration desk in Topeka. It continued through courtrooms and legislatures. It moved into streets and classrooms. It touched millions of lives. Some of those lives were changed profoundly. Others hardly noticed. That is often how progress works. The ground shifts beneath our feet. We realize later we are standing in a different place. The schoolhouse door is a symbol. It represents access and opportunity. It represents the American promise that all children deserve equal education. It represents the gap between our ideals and our reality. Brown versus Board of Education did not close that gap. It gave us the tools to keep trying. It said that separate is inherently unequal. It said that our Constitution demands more. The work continues. The children keep walking to school. The doors open wider each year, not wide enough, not fast enough, but wider than before. That is Oliver Brown's legacy.